Chatting with Jeremy Werner in studio here from Illini Inquirer. There's a lot of excitement, Jeremy, about this season, and that'll happen when you have an 8-5 team. Illinois is relevant again. How do you kind of sum up what they have been to get to this point and all the excitement for this year?
Yeah, Bret Beherns just brought a lot of competency to the program, right? I mean, all of a sudden you're competitive in every game, basically, that he's been a part of. A few exceptions in his first year here, but he's just brought a good style, sustainable style of football back to Illinois. But now this is the big task, right? This is the time when Illinois football fans raise expectations. Only in the recent past, they've been let down the season after. Whether it was 1999, you fall from a bowl team to a non-bowl team. 2001, from the Sugar Bowl to a non-bowl team. Rose Bowl team in 2007 to a non-bowl season. Now it's about building off that and showing that you're not a flash in the pan and building on the success and the foundation that they've built over the last couple of years.
So what are the keys to that? How do they do that is the big question.
Well, they had a great offseason, in my opinion. It's not just about adding transfers and quarterbacks. It's about retaining your talent and the ability to get Johnny Newton and Keith Randolph, Isaiah Adams, Julian Pearl, frankly, 4 guys who could be in the mix for NFL rosters right now, especially Johnny Newton and I think Isaiah Adams. To get those guys to come back for another year, I think shows a lot of buy-in from them because they could be cashing NFL checks right now and instead decided to come back for another year under a staff they trust to get them to the next level and make even more money and have success at Illinois. So getting those guys back in the trenches was huge because I think Illinois offensive line, defensive line, that is the strength of this team. It's one of the best offensive line, defensive line combinations in the Big Ten. And certainly, how do you win games in the final year of the Big Ten West? It's in the trenches. So they have questions, quarterback, defensive back, but they're so good in the trenches with Seth Coleman. Gabe Ack is coming back for another year at outside linebacker as well. That I think that's where the foundation lies. You know they're going to run the football, and you know they're going to probably play good defense.
There's a lot of guys that have left, that are not on this program anymore. You talk about Chase Brown, you talk about Devin Witherspoon, you talk about all the secondary guys drafted, but the trenches there I think is the big thing. How far have they come in that, and how much is that a staple? Shockingly for Bret Beherns' team that they want to run the ball and be solid in the trenches.
Well, and whether you're playing at Georgia, you're playing at Alabama, you still that's how you win football games. You get at the next level to get to the next tier. That's why Wisconsin's kind of changing up what they do. At some point, yes, you got to have explosive offense. You got to have those superstars on the perimeter, but to have steady play week to week, you got to play well in the trenches. And you're right, Bret Beherns, that's what he's been doing his entire career. So that's the necessary step. And the necessary step is recruiting off the successes you've had, whether it's Alex Balcheski, who's now in the pros, Kendrick Green, who's in the pros, and then we look at defensive line. If Johnny Newton, Keith Randolph stay healthy and have the years you think, it's about recruiting that next wave so that you can replace those guys afterwards. But you do have a bunch of guys in the secondary, Bret, you have to replace. And Sidney Brown, Devin Witherspoon, Quan Martin, Kendall Smith even, that now it's up to Bret Beherns and the staff, Aaron Henry, the new defensive coordinator, to replace those guys. After Chase Brown, do you have a good enough running back rotation with Reggie Love and Josh McCray to sustain your success as a rushing football team? Now that's kind of the next test for these guys.
Secondary, I think the biggest concern in that for the Illini this season, you mentioned quarterback, we'll talk about Luke Altmaier, but is this secondary deep enough and talented enough to be as good as it was last year, or at least up to a comparable level?
I think they're talented enough. They've recruited really well at this position, including a bunch of freshmen I think are going to have the chance to play, including Sabor Kareem, Zach Toby, Jaheim Clark. But they've added a lot of transfers for a reason. They've added 3 transfer safeties, Demetrius Hill, Clayton Bush, Nicario Harper. All of those guys have a chance to play. But I think one of the upsides of the end of last year when you struggled is, one of the, I guess you could call them silver linings of some injuries back there, was that Xavier Scott played. Tyler Strain played. And those guys got really good experience that's going to pay off this year. They can't say enough about Xavier Scott, who's taking Quan Martin's role as kind of that star nickel position. Taz Nicholson was really good for you last year, and when he got hurt, you could tell. Illinois secondary suffered a little bit towards the end of last season. Then Tyler Strain played really good football when he was in. So those guys have some experience, but it's not to the level that they have right now. But it's not like you're throwing them new into a situation. Xavier Scott and Tyler Strain played at number 3 Michigan and helped Illinois have a chance to win that game. My big question's at safety. With Matthew Bailey hurt as well, going to miss a couple games to start the season with a setback with that foot injury. What are you going to get out of Clayton Bush out of Southern Illinois? Your alma mater there. And what are you going to get out of Demetrius Hill, a freshman All-American, who's stepping up from Florida International to the Power 5 level? And Miles Scott has kind of been the talk of training camp, that he could be the surprise person at that free safety spot where they get 5 interceptions every year and kind of make stars out of nowhere with Kirby Joseph and Kendall Smith. Can he excel in that role that he's never played before? He played wide receiver last year.
We've talked a lot about the law firm and Johnny Newton and Keith Randolph. I don't know if we can talk about them enough. These guys are marquee level defensive linemen. I mean, this is historic stuff. We're not just hyperbole talking here, right?
And I've said this plenty of times, so I feel comfortable saying it here. Johnny Newton really has no business being in college football anymore. He was that dominant last year. So to get him back, and now he's a projected first-round pick, I still don't understand how you go from not being a third-round pick in the spring to all of a sudden you're immediately a first-round pick. But they got him back, and he is such a disruptive force on the interior, and he's one of the best players in college football, not just for his position, but one of the best players. And then you had Keith Randolph, who we feel is just scratching the surface. I know he's only played 2 years of high school football, and now he's played 4 years of college football, but he is just scratching the surface, and he was great last year. So if he can take his game to another level, and that's what will help a young secondary, is guys like that taking their game to the next level who are already good. And then you had Seth Coleman, who I think at one point last year was one of their best players on defense, which says a lot given all the players they had. But for one stretch he was. If he can be more consistent, and if Gabe Akis, the man-child, takes the step we think he's going to take, this defensive front can really help that secondary.
Yeah, the sophomore already on the freaks list. Like he truly is that. And I think the team feels so much better. If you had it reversed, I don't think you'd feel as good. If you had a great secondary but not a good box and front seven, I think they'll take this way over that way.
Yeah, you're making quarterbacks uncomfortable, right? And Illinois did that a little bit last year with their defensive front, but also with their secondary playing man-to-man coverage. One thing I think we can expect is Aaron Henry play a little less man coverage. It's what they do, but I would expect them to play a little bit more zone so they can have their eyes on the quarterback and just not have as much pressure in man-on-man coverage.
What is a reasonable expectation? They were #1 in scoring defense last year, 12 points per game. I don't think we can expect that, but where would be a good landing spot for them this year defensively?
I think they're going to be really good defensively. Now, that might end up being giving up 19 to 20 points a game, but that would be top 20 in the country last year, right?
So have some perspective, right?
And I think we got to think they're playing in the Big Ten West. There's not a lot of explosive offenses here. You know, Penn State's good, but I think they're better defensively even than they are offensively. So the schedule racks up to where I think they should be pretty good. I expect them to make more mistakes, right? I expect the secondary to make a few more mistakes. I don't expect as many maybe 7-point, 10-point performances from the opponents, but I still expect this defense to be very good because their defensive front is one of the best in the country. They just have to stay healthy because Johnny Newton, Keith Randolph, the depth behind them is pretty unproven, and they had a couple recruiting classes that weren't great on the defensive line.
Talking about staying healthy, quarterback, the position I think they have to stay healthy at utmost and foremost. But Luke Altmaier has the job. Not a surprise for us that have been covering the program.
Big competition.
Correct. They maybe wanted to tout it that way. It was not. But what does Luke Altmaier bring to the table for this program and for this position that really has had quite a bit of turnover here in the past, decade?
Well, he's a dynamic talent. Luke Altmaier was a 4-star prospect, had offers from Alabama, Ole Miss, a bunch of SEC programs from Starkville, Mississippi, and he got on the field, right? He was a true freshman backup to Matt Corral, who was a 3rd-round draft pick in the NFL. Jackson Dart beat him out for the starting job, but Luke Altmaier took him into the season. It took his injury to his shoulder to really have him lose that job, and Jackson Dart kind of took it over. He can throw a pretty ball. He might not have the biggest cannon for an arm, but he just places it incredibly well, really catchable ball, really accurate with his throws, and he's a dynamic runner. The one thing he doesn't bring is a lot of experience. He has experience in a quarterback room, a talented quarterback room, a talented offense with Lane Kiffin at Ole Miss, and he's got some playing experience, played in a Sugar Bowl as a backup when Matt Corral got hurt, but he's only got 140-something college snaps. So I would expect growing pains from him. Tommy DeVito had 1,200 snaps coming into Illinois. He knew what it was. He just needed to be protected, and he played really, really well. He hit the singles and doubles incredibly well. I expect Luke Altmaier to hit more home runs, but I expect him to have a few more turnovers and maybe some plays that hurt his team. The key for him early is minimizing those things.
And I think if we're just standing here before the season talking, to me it's about red zone and explosive plays, two things they really did not do well last year. And Barry Lundy Jr. has talked about that. They have to be better at that this year to take another step offensively.
Yeah, what they did great last year was ran the ball pretty well. We're in a top 5 Big Ten running offense, but Chase Brown was fantastic. And they took care of the ball. They held the ball a long time. It was a ball control offense. Now that year 2, Barry Lundy wants to get more explosive, right? You want more plays over the top. You want Pat Bryant, Isaiah Williams to get more plays down the field. Maybe Malik Elzy, the freshman wide receiver everyone's so excited about. And then you want a running back rotation. I think Josh McCray's injury really hurt them last year because he was a guy in the red zone, in the goal line, they give the ball to, pound it in. Chase Brown wasn't that back. He was great at a lot of things. He wasn't great at that. The other thing, Tommy DeVito's ankle injury, I think, hurt him a little bit. He's a good runner, had 3 touchdowns, I think it was, against Wisconsin. And then he gets that ankle injury, wasn't quite the same runner. Luke Altmaier's a really good athlete, so he needs to stay healthy. You're not going to put him in harm's way, but I do think his running ability goes a little underrated. And I think if you can keep those running backs a little fresher late in games, unlike giving 40 carries to a back, 35 carries to a back, I think that can help you in the red zone when you get to a 12th or 13th play of a drive. And
it's going to look different because Chase Brown got the ball so much last year. I don't think we expect to see that. We're going to have more rotational pieces this year.
Yeah, and it's Barry Lunny. This is year 2. You want to take a big step.
Yeah.
He's saying that about himself. I think we all say it. We saw good things from Barry Lunny last year, but there were some things that weren't great. And I think the red zone was part of that. So I think that's his next step as an offense coordinator. He knows it. He's putting it on himself. So I think it's a big year for Barry Lunny to lead that offense. And now the terminology, they all know it. All these other players out around Luke Altmaier have been part of it. You got a good offensive line. It's their deepest wide receiver room, deepest running back room they've had under Bret Beherns. They think a deeper offensive line. So if Luke Altmaier can manage those things and be efficient, I think this offense should take another step forward.
All right, let's look whole picture here. Illinois will succeed this season if they do what well?
If the quarterback stays healthy and their defensive line stays healthy, I feel pretty confident in that. Because I do think the one thing we like about this team, Brett, we know they're going to run the football well.
Yeah.
And even though they lost some talent on defense, this is going to be a good defense. So I think the floor is extremely high. So for me, it's can Luke Altmaier minimize mistakes? Can the secondary minimize mistakes? Because it's the Big Ten West. There's going to be a lot of close games. Even Toledo and Kansas. I think those could be really close games. You got to be able to limit mistakes, penalties, turnovers. That's why they lost Indiana last year, right? That's why they lost Michigan State. Some of those games they lost that could have led them to a Big Ten West championship and Big Ten championship game. Those are things they need to minimize because otherwise, man, you feel good about the foundation. It's just the newer parts of the offense and defense.
Couple freshmen, maybe we can keep an eye out. We can't say as many as we used to 5 or 6 years ago.
Yeah, which is a really good thing. Like starting 16 freshmen like they did in Lovie Smith's second year, that is not normal. You want these guys to have some time to develop so that year 3, year 4, that's when they're really making their huge impact. But we start with 2 in-state kids, right? Malik Elzy, everyone's excited about 4-star wide receiver, Chicago Simeon. It's the type of talent they really need at that position. Long, strong, 6'3", 200 pounds, 210 pounds, I think they listed him at. But also can have play after the catch. He's a fast wide receiver. So I don't know if I expect him to be like the top wide receiver, be a starter. Maybe it could be at some point this year, but I think he's going to make an impact. And the local kid, Caden Fagan, Bret Beherns continues to talk about the 6'3", 250-pound running back out of obviously Arthur Lovington Atwood Hammond. And he's got a potential role behind Josh McCray as a big back. I think he's going to get some action this year.
He is a large man. Just a freshman, that is for sure. All right. This first 3 games of the season, to me, this is where it all comes down to hey, is Illinois going to get off to a good start? If they're 1-2, if they lose at Kansas, if they lose to Penn State, what's your response to that? What's a good number there for these first 3 games?
It's a tough September. Toledo, Illinois' got this gift of scheduling non-conference opponents.
It's crazy, right?
When they come around to playing in 10 years, they're at the best point of their, remember Western Michigan a couple of years ago, USF. These teams always seem to be in their best position. Toledo's coming off a MAC championship. Kansas, best year ever with Lance Leipold, who we thought might be the Illinois coach when they hired Bielema. So that's a tough start, especially going on the road to Kansas. And then your first Big Ten game, no sign Indiana. It is Penn State. So that is a tough start. Then you get Purdue in a couple weeks after that. Listen, I have them going 1-2. I think there's going to be a stumble to start the season. Maybe it's not 1-2, but I do expect them to have some growing pains early in the season. And if they have a turnover-filled game or a penalty-filled game, they can lose one of those first 2 games. Now, I think Penn State's a great opportunity because I do think Illinois can win that game, but they're just superior talented up and down the roster. But Illinois has a chance to win that game. But I think this team will bounce back. I think we've seen from Bret Beherns that just because they lose an early game, the whole season won't go down the drain like it has in years past. So I think this is a schedule that you can lose to any opponent you have on the schedule. And I would include Florida Atlantic. I think it would take a really bad game for them to lose that. But I think you can lose to any opponent if you don't bring it. But I think they can beat any opponent, too. That's what's going to make this kind of a nerve-wracking September, a nerve-wracking season. But I don't think it's going to make it exciting because I think the spectrum of what this team can do is probably between 5 and 10 wins.
So where do you have them at? I think Vegas has it at 6.5.
Yeah.
Do you fall In line with that?
Yeah, I said take the over. I would take the over. I think this team is going to win more games than it loses for a second year in a row, which it's been a long time since that has happened.
Decade plus.
For Illinois. And even in the Big Ten. Like, I think they're going to win more Big Ten games than they lose. It'll be the first time since 89-90 that they will be able to do that. So I picked 8-4. I have them in the Big Ten race in November. I do have Iowa. Losing to Iowa on the road, I think that's a really tough place to play. So I don't have them representing the Big Ten West in the Big Ten championship game. But I think this is a big year for Illinois to show they can sustain success. That's why Bret Beherns was brought here, to beat Iowa, to beat Wisconsin, to beat Kansas State. I think this is a year they can show they can do it.
Yeah, and a big thing for Illini fans, talking to them, I know, just be in the game. Give yourself a chance. That hasn't always been the case at Illinois. Jeremy, what do you got on the site here as we look forward to the season, getting ready for Saturday's kickoff?
Speaking of our overs and unders, we got overs and unders we're betting on. We got my season predictions. I go game by game for all of that. And takeaways from being able to talk with these coaches on Monday, previewing a big game against Toledo. I think that place, if you can win your first 2 games, Brett, that Penn State game, it could be a nice crowd there.
Yeah, I think it would be. We'll see what they do. Jeremy Werner from Illini Inquirer, always the best. Jeremy, thanks.
Thanks, Brett.